The stench of necrotic flesh clung to the silk bed drapes. It had been there since his birth, some claimed, since before. Don Carlos, heir to the Spanish Empire, came into the world with a twisted spine, a misshapen head, and eyes too wide to blink without trembling. His skull had not closed properly, giving his head an elongated, unnatural contour. His jaw protruded grotesquely from his face. His teeth were crooked and yellow by childhood, and his left leg dragged behind the right. His gait was uneven, his breath often wheezing, and his temper explosive. Servants learned quickly, do not meet the prince's gaze for long. Do not refuse him a toy. Do not delay his horse. Do not correct his Latin. It was said quietly, always behind closed doors, that the child was broken from within, malformed not by God, but by blood too royal for its own good. Habsburg blood. The House of Habsburg had ruled for centuries by keeping bloodlines close, too close. Don Carlos's mother was his father's first cousin, and his grandmother had been his grandfather's niece. Generation after generation of the same bones grinding together, creating a lineage that ruled half the world and gave birth to a boy who could barely speak without stuttering and choking on his own tongue. From infancy, the court's physicians poked and prodded him like a malformed relic, leeching, bleeding, purging. They blamed vapors for his seizures and used burning irons to open the devil's humors in his skull. He was 5 when he tried to kill a servant for trimming his nails too short, 8 when he drowned a stable boy in a trough. By 12, he carried a dagger beneath his robes and once threatened to stab a tutor for misquoting Virgil. The king saw all of it, his only son, his only heir, and said nothing. Philip II of Spain did not believe in softness. He ruled by iron and silence, and he raised his son with both. To Philip, God ordained the crown, and suffering was the soul's price for power. But Carlos wasn't suffering toward holiness. He was slipping into something worse, madness. The boy was volatile, unpredictable, repulsive in his arrogance, but still, he was a prince. At court, Carlos was draped in velvet and gold-threaded tunics, the deformities hidden behind royal splendor. He was taught to dance, he could not. He was taught to joust, he injured his own horse. He was taught to charm, but his eyes darted too violently for anyone to feel safe in his presence. Diplomats from Austria, France, and England smiled thinly when presented to him. A few whispered later that the boy looked more like a goblin than a monarch. Philip's advisors begged the king to disinherit the boy, send him to a monastery, some said, to a distant outpost, others offered. But Philip shook his head. The king had been raised in fear of God's order, and that order had named Carlos as heir. To remove him would be to tempt divine wrath, or perhaps worse, political scandal. So the heir remained, a sickness sealed in silk. In 1562, Carlos fell down a marble staircase while chasing a servant boy. He cracked his skull again and lay unconscious for days, bleeding from the ear. Surgeons feared he would die. Priests administered last rites. His mother, long dead, was said to have appeared in visions, beckoning. But Carlos lived. He awoke changed, angrier, louder, filthier. He screamed through the halls at night. He urinated on the cathedral floors. He refused to eat food unless it was tasted by his dwarf jester. And worst of all, he began whispering into the ears of soldiers, asking them strange questions. Do you know how to slit a throat in silence? Would you protect me from my father? Rumors swirled. Was the prince planning a coup? Was he being used by rebellious nobles? Was he possessed? Philip watched in silence as his son's shadow darkened each hallway of the Escorial Palace. Every week brought a new outrage. One day, Carlos demanded a young nobleman's wife be sent to his room. When she refused, he ordered her husband whipped and confined to the dungeons. Another time, he tried to burn the wings off a swan in the royal lake, cackling as feathers caught fire. But still, he was the heir. Philip held state councils late into the night, speaking in murmurs with his confessors and generals. One nobleman, it said, left the king's chamber pale and trembling after a private audience. He would never speak of what had been discussed, but he soon retired from court and fled to Granada, too. In public, Carlos was increasingly paraded like a saint in pain, swathed in golden robes, jewels around his twisted wrists, carried in a litter when his leg would not obey. The people saw a prince, a future king, and whispered prayers. But inside the palace, a question festered. What if this prince becomes king? There was no answer. There was only the smell of incense and rot. By 1567, Spain was burning on the edges. Rebellions in the Low Countries, unrest in Italy, heretics in the streets. And at the center of it all, a prince who set fires in his own garden just to watch the servants panic. Philip began to avoid his son's chambers. Their meals were taken separately, their prayers no longer shared. On some nights, Philip sat alone in his study, staring at a cracked ivory crucifix. Behind him, maps of the empire stretched across the walls, vast, magnificent, and fragile. And at the heart of it, Carlos, screaming into the dark. The court's whispers grew louder. Some claimed Carlos had tried to poison the king's food. Others insisted he'd plotted to escape to Flanders and lead a revolt. Perhaps neither was true. Perhaps both were. But it didn't matter. On a cold January night in 1568, the silence broke. King Philip II, in full battle armor, bashed open his son's bedchamber door. He entered not as a father, but as a sovereign executing divine justice. His face was pale, his eyes unreadable behind his steel visor. Behind him marched guards, armed, grim, silent. Carlos sat up, dazed, trembling beneath his silk sheets. He looked at his father and saw nothing human in the face, not a flicker of mercy, not even hatred. The king spoke once you are under arrest. The boy, now a man in years, only screamed. He thrashed. He begged. He tore at his bedsheets and tried to grab the dagger hidden beneath his mattress. But the guards were faster. They bound him, gagged him, and dragged him through the palace. No trial, no counsel, no verdict. The heir of the Spanish Empire was led into a dark stone chamber, and the door slammed shut behind him. The lock turned with a dull finality, and the rot began. The stone walls drank sound, thick, ancient granite, cool to the touch, and immune to pleading. Within them, the Prince of Asturias, once heir to the greatest empire on earth, found himself exiled from sunlight. The chamber was neither a cell nor a room, but something liminal, too wide to feel safe, too small to feel free. A single slatted window, no larger than a letterbox, faced north, so no direct light would ever enter. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of mildew and human sweat soaked into flagstone. It would have driven a sane man mad. For Don Carlos, already fractured by blood, it became a crucible of destruction. Outside his prison, the court entered a collective silence, a performance of forgetfulness No official statement was made, no proclamation issued, only a muttered explanation. For reasons of state, his name was not spoken at council. His seat at Mass remained empty. His likeness, once being prepared for a fresco in the royal chapel, was quietly scraped from the plaster. Even the servants who'd once combed his matted hair and sponged his malformed limbs were reassigned or dismissed. He became a ghost in his own kingdom, buried not in soil but in secrecy. But within the court, tension festered like a wound left to rot. Philip II claimed divine authority, but his enemies saw something else, a father who had turned on his son. In France, the Guise family whispered of a king who devoured his own bloodline. In Rome, papal envoys debated whether the imprisonment violated sacred bonds of lineage. In the Protestant North, the story was weaponized an emperor of superstition and cruelty, driven mad by inbreeding and zealotry. Philip remained silent. His silence was doctrine, and doctrine was iron. But not all whispers remained whispers. Before the chamber door had even grown cold, nobles aligned with Carlos began disappearing. Some vanished into dungeons. Others simply stopped appearing at court. A few were found drowned in the river or accidentally crushed beneath their horses. The king's secretaries kept lists. The Inquisition, already an arm of Philip's will, watched closely. Among the most prominent was Juan de Escobedo, a secretary suspected of relaying Carlos's letters to rebellious factions in the Netherlands. When summoned to Madrid for questioning, he arrived pale, already shaking. Days later, he was dead, stabbed by criminals in the street. The blade entered through his side. Some said it bore the seal of the royal guard. Letters were burned, portraits defaced. Don Carlos was being erased not only in flesh, but in memory. Inside his prison, he began to deteriorate with terrifying speed. At first, the prince screamed through the stone, for hours, then days. He clawed the wooden door until his fingernails split. He threw his chamber pot at the walls, then sobbed when the filth pooled beneath his bedding. No food was allowed to him unless tasted thrice by guards, then inspected by royal physicians. Still, Carlos believed he was being poisoned. He refused to eat. His gums bled, his eyes swelled, his stool turned black, then stopped altogether. He began to hallucinate visions of his dead mother with burning eyes, his father in armor dripping blood, angels made of iron and flame. He spoke to shadows. He composed letters to the Virgin Mary, using his own blood. He tore pages from his prayer book and ate them, believing they would protect him. By the third week, the guards were instructed to speak no words to him. Silence bred paranoia. Carlos responded by reciting scripture at deafening volume, pounding the walls with broken crockery, threatening the saints with damnation. A doctor who visited him afterward claimed the prince had chewed off part of his own tongue in delirium. When asked if he was in pain, Carlos whispered, "The pain was born before me." Still, Philip did not flinch. To the king, this was not vengeance, it was purification. In his private quarters, Philip knelt for hours before his crucifix. He refused music. He forbade laughter in his chambers. Some nights, he read aloud from the Imitation of Christ, muttering passages about renunciation, sacrifice, and divine wrath. He had not only imprisoned his son, he had offered him to God. He consulted the Inquisition privately, not about heresy, but about spirits. Could madness be a sign of possession? Was Carlos a vessel for unclean forces? Could a king's son be the devil's pawn? The inquisitors gave no answer, but others sought clarity in blood. In the Low Countries, where Protestant rebellion was growing bolder, the story of Carlos became a banner. Pamphlets smuggled across borders declared, "Behold the prince who fell to Catholic madness." Dutch revolutionaries raised paintings of Carlos in chains, calling him the martyr of Madrid. Some claimed he'd been tortured. Others, that he had escaped and was leading a secret army to liberate Europe. None of it was true. But truth was never the point. In the palace, the walls grew heavier with silence. By mid-spring, Carlos had stopped screaming. He had begun instead to whisper soft, broken nonsense to invisible listeners. He stood for hours beneath the narrow window, whispering up to the sky. When the wind carried church bells, he wept. When it didn't, he chewed strips of his bedding and muttered Latin syllables through frothing lips. A servant later recalled seeing him through the viewing slot. His skin hung from him like wet parchment. His hair had gone white. He stared not at the door, but past it as if waiting for something holy or monstrous. And the court moved on. New treaties were signed, new wars declared. The king's other children grew tall and healthy. Painters painted allegories of virtue and obedience, always without Don Carlos. Philip, in public, appeared unshaken, but behind closed doors, he began sleeping with relics pressed to his chest, a splinter of the true cross, a scrap of St. Bartholomew's robe. He no longer spoke the boy's name. He no longer visited the tower. But the tower remembered. Its stones absorbed the rot. The bed frame, once gilded, was now rusted and stained with bodily fluids. The floor held urine, vomit, old blood. The walls bore fingernail scratches lines that formed nothing and everything. Then, on a night in July, the guards heard nothing. No pacing, no chants, no sobs. Silence. When they opened the door, the stench hit them first foul, cloying, unmistakable. Carlos lay sprawled across the floor, naked, filthy, sunken. He was still alive, but barely. His stomach had bloated grotesquely. His lips were cracked, bleeding. His legs had swollen, blackened at the ankles. Maggots had begun to appear around an ulcer on his thigh. He smiled. When they asked if he wished to see a priest, he said, "Tell my father I forgive him, but not his God." The door closed once more. The end was near, and everyone knew it. But still, the court remained silent. No one wept, no bells were prepared, no masses announced. In this grand empire of gold, the heir to the throne had become an inconvenience, and soon he would be gone. On the morning of July 24th, 1568, the stench wafted before the sound. It leaked under the heavy oak door like a sick wind, curling through the tower's stairwell, turning the stomachs of guards long used to blood. When they unlocked the chamber, they didn't open the door fully, just enough to peer in, just enough to confirm the inevitable. Don Carlos, once heir to the Spanish Empire, was lying on his back, naked on the stone floor. His body was so swollen with gas and decay that the skin had split open across his abdomen. Purple-green bruises bloomed like dead roses from his thighs to his ribs. His eyes had sunken into their sockets. His lips were peeled back in a stiff, permanent grimace that could have been mistaken for a smile if not for the flies that fed on the dried foam around his gums. His arms were outstretched, one hand clenched around a rag soaked with blood and feces. His tongue protruded slightly, and beneath his ribs, near the open wound on his left side, something moved. Maggots, hundreds of them. The heir had not died cleanly, nor quickly. He had rotted alive. Every hour a slow murder of flesh by his own blood, his own hunger, his own mind. The stone chamber had become his coffin long before his breath stopped. This was not just a death. It was a deconstruction of body, of soul, of legacy. The guards did not speak. They closed the door again, sealing the stench back inside. For 3 more days, his corpse was left untouched. The king gave no order for burial. No priests were summoned. No rites spoken. The court simply waited. Rumors floated like fog across the palace that Carlos's body was left to rot as penance, that the Inquisition was examining it for signs of demonic corruption, that the king himself wanted to be sure, utterly sure, that his son would not rise again in flesh or legend. But there was no miracle. Only the bloating, the putrefaction, the silence. Finally, on the 4th day, Philip issued the command: remove the body, not bury, not honor, just remove. What followed was perhaps the most horrifying scene in all of the Escorial's history. 4 servants entered the chamber with cloths over their faces and vinegar-soaked rags pressed to their mouths. The body had begun to melt skin, sloughing off like old wax. They attempted to lift him, but the corpse tore. The right arm detached at the shoulder. The servants recoiled in horror, then vomited where they stood. They tried again, wrapping him in linen sheets and hoisting him like a sack of grain. As they moved, a wet, ripping noise echoed through the stairwell, the sound of rot resisting removal. Blood that wasn't blood anymore dripped in trails behind them. One servant fainted. Another screamed when a cluster of beetles burst from the hollow of Carlos's mouth. The corpse was taken not to a cathedral, but to a lower vault beneath the monastery. No public funeral, no mourners, no procession, just cold stone and silence. There, Don Carlos was placed inside a lead-lined coffin, his name scratched faintly onto the lid, his title omitted. No prayers were spoken aloud, only whispered, "Lord, have mercy." When news of his death reached the European courts, reactions fractured. In France, some wept. Queen Elizabeth of England expressed shock, but privately called it an end befitting Catholic tyranny. Protestant writers compared Carlos to Christ, abandoned, betrayed, executed without trial. In the Netherlands, rebel factions declared him a martyr, painting banners of the prisoner prince and marching with his distorted image beside saints and angels. They said he had died for their freedom, that he had been murdered for wanting peace. But none of it was true. There had been no peace in Carlos's heart, no plan, no vision of reform, only confusion, rage, madness. But the spectacle of his death was too grotesque to ignore and too useful to waste. Even Philip II, who had consigned his son to this slow crucifixion, could not escape the stain. Whispers crept into the cathedral pews and the brothels alike that the king had ordered poison, that he had watched his son starve and smiled, that God had cursed the royal bloodline, that Carlos's ghost now wandered the halls of El Escorial, barefoot and weeping, pressing his ruined face against the windows. Within the royal household, all portraits of Carlos were removed. Those being painted were destroyed or modified. His name was struck from official records of succession. Court poets were forbidden from speaking of him. His personal belongings, his books, his dagger, the malformed suit of armor made for his hunched frame were burned in the palace courtyard under heavy guard. But history is not so easily erased. Even in his decay, Carlos lingered. His decomposition was symbolic not just of a body, but of a lineage, a family tree so tightly wound that it strangled itself. In the rot of Carlos, Europe saw the warning that power hoarded becomes poison, that crowns bred in isolation fester, that kings can murder their own heirs and call it justice. The death of Don Carlos was not a royal tragedy. It was a royal confession. That behind the marble, the candles, the processions, lay a dynasty collapsing under its own weight. And no one dared to look too long at the blood on the crown. The coffin of Don Carlos sealed in lead, and silence was lowered into the vault beneath the monastery of El Escorial, without hymn or herald. Above him, the basilica bells remained still. No courtiers wore mourning black. No widow's veil shrouded a grieving mother's face. There was no mother left to weep. No kingdom left to witness. Only the stone, and the rot, and the weight of history collapsing inward like a lung punctured from within. Within days, his name vanished from court conversation. Chroniclers wrote of reasons of state, ministers deflected, and Philip, the most pious and ruthless monarch of his age, resumed his correspondence with bishops and generals as if nothing had happened. Yet there were moments, brief, flickering, where those close to him claimed the king paused, long after the palace was asleep, his hand hovering over a letter he would never send, his lips forming a name he no longer dared to utter. Don Carlos. But Carlos would not remain still beneath the stones. He began to return in stories, in whispers, in distorted portraits painted in secret, in ballads sung by peasants who had never seen his face but heard tales of the boy with the twisted back and shattered mind, in broadsheets smuggled through Protestant cities that called him the broken prince, the living corpse, the saint of rebellion. Writers in the Low Countries depicted him as a political prisoner, a dreamer who tried to free Flanders from Catholic tyranny. In truth, Carlos had never set foot in the Netherlands, and barely understood the politics of empire. But truth no longer mattered. His legend had begun to molt, shedding the madness, the deformity, the violence, and donning the costume of martyrdom. And yet, in Spain, nothing. The royal archives omitted him from succession tables. Court painters painted younger siblings with new coats of arms. Carlos's was buried with him, his seal cracked and discarded. When ambassadors asked after the prince, they were met with stone-faced denials. His Highness died of natural illness, they were told. Or his mind was too fragile for public life. Or, most chillingly, there was no Don Carlos. But the stones of El Escorial remembered, and so did the bodies. A decade after Carlos's death, construction workers in the lower crypt claimed to smell something foul seeping from the walls near the vault. When they opened it, they found the lead coffin swollen and leaking. The body inside had liquefied. One man fainted. Another wept, saying he'd seen the prince's face in a dream, bloated, eyeless, begging for light. The coffin was resealed, double-bound with iron and hidden behind an unmarked slab. It remains there still. Above the crypt, the empire Carlos never ruled continued its long decline. Spain bled gold into foreign wars, heretics burned, plague returned, and the Habsburg line marched onward, each generation bearing the same chin, the same eyes, the same slow rot of inherited silence, until finally, in 1700, the line collapsed into itself. The last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, was born so deformed and sickly that he could not speak until the age of 4, nor walk without assistance, nor produce an heir. The rot had come full circle. Some say Carlos was the first warning. Others say he was the punishment. In later centuries, historians would argue over his diagnosis: schizophrenia, porphyria, congenital syphilis, psychosis born from incestuous bloodlines. But diagnosis misses the point. Carlos was not just sick. He was a mirror, held up to an empire that prized purity over sanity, divinity over love, order over mercy. He was the cost of a crown too heavy for human heads. The story of Don Carlos ends not in the crypt, but in the silence that follows it. The empty spaces where his portrait should have hung. The official records where his name should have remained. The palace halls where his footsteps no longer echo, but where some say on cold nights you can still hear them. A slow, limping drag. One step, then the other. Not seeking revenge, not even justice, only remembrance. And so he walks on, beneath the stones, beyond the books, rotted but not erased. The boy prince was born into gold and marble, but died in filth and stone, in a world shaped by divine right, where bloodlines were sacred and the crown infallible. There was no place for weakness, especially not in the heir. His flesh had betrayed him from birth, warped by generations of incest, crushed under the weight of a father's fear. And when that flesh began to stink, to scream, to spoil, there was no grace extended, no hand held out, no salvation whispered through the keyhole. Only silence. And in that silence, a legacy was buried not just of one boy, but of what it means to love within power, to raise a child not as a son, but as a symbol. Philip II, for all his piety, for all his pageantry, died with the stench of his heir etched into the walls of his soul. Perhaps that was his penance. Perhaps it was worse. Today, few remember Carlos as anything but a footnote, a malformed heir who never ruled. But the stones remember, and memory does not die as easily as flesh. Beyond the vaults and prayers, beyond even the reach of empire, something lingers, a name, half spoken, a face, half rotted, a crown, denied. Not even time could bury him fully.